Welcome, everyone. My name is Kim. I'm the Postdoctoral Services and Professional Skills Coordinator in the Faculty of Graduate Studies. We're really pleased to see you here today for the third and final session of the Applied Qualitative Research series. So everyone knows, the recordings of the previous sessions are available, and I will add a link to the chat in just a couple of minutes so that you know where those are available. Today's session is the third in our series. It is presenting and publishing qualitative findings. This webinar provides you with advanced strategies for effectively presenting qualitative research findings through scholarly publications and professional presentation. You'll learn how to synthesize complex qualitative data into clear, compelling narratives, structure manuscripts to meet peer-reviewed journal standards, and design impactful conference presentations. The session will also address best practices for visualizing qualitative results, aligning dissemination approaches with academic and professional expectations, and overcoming common challenges in communicating qualitative research. And once again, we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Karen Campbell, an assistant professor in the School of Nursing. Dr. Campbell's program of research focuses on the intersections of women's health with physical and social geography. She's taught graduate level courses in qualitative research and designed and conducted multiple applied qualitative research projects using a broad range of study designs and approaches to analysis. So welcome, and I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Kim. I think that we were really, like pie in the sky whenever we started talking about this webinar. And then we could talk about all of those things for like 6 days. So today we'll get through as much as we can of what we put out there. Hopefully some of this will be refreshing to you. It'll be confirming what maybe some of you are already doing. And maybe for some people, it's going to be new content and new ideas. And that is great too. We will stop the recording at the end so that you can ask your own questions. But I do encourage you to ask for clarification or ask me for any questions as I'm going through, because really this is intended to support you. This presentation, continue to share. This presentation is we've used with our team to kind of help our research labs to be able to publish qualitative work. And I hope that it's helpful for you. I'm going to jump right into content because, like Kim said, we've got lots to talk about during this. And I do want to make sure that we have enough time towards the end to answer any of your specific questions that you might have. And we will stop the recording for that so that you can feel comfortable to share any of your questions that are very specific to your projects. But I wanted to dive in with just talking about the structure of presenting a publishable qualitative study. And I would say that the information in the background, very, very similar to what you would find in a quantitative research paper, really making sure that you've got your purpose and significance, the context of the problem that you have, the description, a clear description of the problem that is leading to your study. In some cases, you might also need to have a theoretical framework, and you might need that theoretical framework because many of you are graduate students, and so you may be required to have some sort of theory that's guiding your research work. This doesn't always happen with qualitative, especially applied qualitative work. We don't always have a theoretical framework that might guide us. And so you may or may not see this in other research articles that you're reading. If you do have it, I do think putting it in your background is helpful when it's kind of a broad type of theoretical framework. So something like feminism or critical race theory. So one of those broad types of theories that really guided how you saw the data, why you saw the data that way. And I think that is important so that the readers are able to understand where you were coming from. However, we might also see this theoretical framework instead be in the methods part of your paper. So where the theoretical framework was very specifically used to guide the development of questions, where it was helping to determine who you were going to talk to or how you were using it for analysis. I think that I would sooner put into that section. So just a little note about that. I also think that it's really important to end your introduction or your background with really clear research questions. If you don't have this in here, a clearly outlined objective, two things will happen. One, I think that the reviewers will ask you for that. And the second thing is that at some point, an undergrad student is going to read your paper. They're going to have to read your paper for a course, and they're going to have to find what that research question is. So just make it really nice and easy for that undergraduate student that has to read it. That's a little bit of a joke on my part. But again, just making sure that that research question is really clearly articulated at the end. Literature review, again, very similar to how what you're going to see in any kind of research paper. I think that what's really important is to think about what's required from the journal that you're choosing. So different than when you're writing this for your dissertation chapter, your literature review is going to have to be synthesized enough that it shows that you've explored all of the research that's out there. You have a solid foundation that tells why you need to do this study and how this wasn't done before or how it needed to be done differently than how it's been done in the past. Because in qualitative research, we're typically not trying to replicate studies the way that you might see in other types of research. We're trying to add to it to find out something new or something different. So really being clear about what's out there and also what's missing in the current body of literature. You may need to organize these into themes or show patterns in the research. And the reason why you might have to do this, especially in a publishable article, is because we're limited in the space that you have, and we're seeing more and more limits on how much you can have. So you have to be very, very tight in your writing. So coming to the methods part, and if you've followed me for any of the other webinars that we put on here, you know that I am an applied researcher, so really thinking about practical applications. So this, again, is somewhere where I really think we have to be very, very clear, very succinct, and very transparent in what exactly we did. So in this space, you're going to want to detail the research design. So maybe you're using phenomenology or case study or interpretive description. Be really clear about what the method was, what it is, that you know what it is. So not using phenomenology or interpretive phenomenological analysis without knowing what that means. So if you are using something that's detailed and has really big origins or roots that has lots of theoretical baggage behind it, like ethnography or phenomenology, make sure that you describe that. There's a beautiful paper that's out. I think it's actually an older paper now from 2014 about phenomenology and its use in nursing. And what they found was a lot of people saying that they were doing phenomenology, but then only ever referring to the lived experience and what they're talking about. So being able to be really clear about what your design is. And if you don't know your design and you're doing a qualitative study, then you're likely doing a qualitative description study, and that's okay. So describe that. Use other citations like Marguerite Sandalowski, who does detail how to do just a qualitative description study, because sometimes we just need to know what the qualitative data said about a phenomenon, and we just want to explain it. So being clear about the suitability of the method that you're using and what it is. The sample strategy and the data collection methods have to be listed in there. So did you do interviews? Did you do focus groups? Were there other types of Were there other types of data that you wanted to use that you should have used and you weren't able to? Were there other documents that you looked at, artifacts? In some studies, we've had people do journals about what they've eaten for a day, or journals about their experiences of motherhood, or we've looked at photographs for women that have lived in experiences of violence. So thinking about all of the different methods that you have used and being clear in that. I will give the caveat that sometimes we do use methods and different strategies for data collection. And in I think the first seminar that we did in this series, we talked about all sorts of different data collection means beyond just interviews and focus groups in qualitative research. Sometimes it might not be specific to this analysis that you did. And maybe this analysis was just about interviews or was just about was just about photographs and your analysis of those, or your analysis of documents or policies that are existing. And so you don't have to include everything that you're doing in your dissertation for a publishable paper. You can just take one part and write about just that. So we just watched the data collection for the specific analysis that you're sharing. Any ethical considerations, and this is a necessary thing for any publishable paper that you're going to do. So did you get ethics for it? Was there informed consent? Was there a verbal consent that happened? How were things kept confidential? All of that needs to be addressed in your in how you're writing this up. With data analysis, it's really important that you're clear about what you were doing. So in our last series, we talked about reflexive thematic analysis. So not only do you want to say that you did reflexive thematic analysis, but you also want to include what that meant. So whose type of thematic analysis did you do? Were you doing a codebook thematic analysis, or were you doing a reflexive thematic analysis? And if you were doing Brown and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis, then write about the 6 steps, because not everybody does it the same way. So if you were doing it that way, then do outline exactly what you did. If you were doing reflexive writing, or if you were looking at positionality, then include all of that data in there so that it's really, really clear about how you came to this, how you came to the results of this. If you use software, and in vivo is very popular in Canada, but so is Quarkus across the world with students. So Quarkus is another, I would say, more financially viable software. There's Atlas is very and MaxQDA are both very popular in the US. So if you used software, then please put that in there. If you didn't use software, that's absolutely okay, especially if the amount of interviews that you had were, or data collection sources, if that was manageable to do without software. So software is helpful for those of you that might be on large teams where we're working with a lab. Maybe we've done 80 interviews. And obviously 80 interviews is a massive, massive qualitative, I was going to say nightmare, but I will say nightmare. It's a qualitative mess. And so it's unlikely that we're going to analyze and look at 80 transcripts or 80 data collection sources in one paper. It's more likely that we're going to find patterns among that, and we're going to write about those in multiple papers, because that is a lot of data to distill into one paper. It just wouldn't be possible. And if I was the reviewer on that, I would ask why and how you were able to do that, unless the data was really thin. So if you're using something like in vivo for a big study like that, it does help to organize things so that we can say, okay, this was about this. We're putting it over here in this data software. If you have maybe 10 interviews, 20, even 30 interviews, which is a great size for a graduate 10 for a master's, maybe 30 for a PhD study. If you have something like that, it may be certainly on the side of 10 to 15. It may be absolutely fine to use something like Word or PowerPoint or different places like that to organize your data. Excel files are often, so anything in the Microsoft suite is often really, really um, it's a good way to manage that. So putting your transcripts into Word documents, maybe you're going to code it and drop those into an Excel document. Maybe you're going to see where the patterns meet by using a PowerPoint presentation. So all of that can come together without using software. So absolutely fine use of that. But whatever you do, make sure that you're really clear and clearly describe it in your methods. I do think that this is somewhere that oftentimes in manuscripts we don't give enough attention to this, and oftentimes then reviewers are asking for more information about this. So be really clear on the up on in the beginning about how you're doing that. And then we move on to the meat and potatoes, if you will, of your paper, which is your intellectual work, the work that you did to make the data that you have come to life. And this is done in lots of different ways in qualitative work. It may be that you're presenting themes, and this is very common way of presenting qualitative work. Um, Major themes are often included with sometimes minor themes below them. And just in case you missed the last presentation, I'm going to give you an example of kind of what a theme is. And Brown and Clark, I love their analogy. I love analogies, period, but I love their analogy of the solar system. So your idea, your main idea, your narrative is like the sun, and the themes are the patterns that or the planets that go around it. Other people have often looked at themes as characters in a movie. So this weekend I went to see a movie, which I haven't in a year and a half. But I did go to see Wuthering Heights this weekend. And if you can go see it, go see it. It was really good. But while I was watching it, I was thinking about this idea of characters being themes. And this is a great example of it because you have this tragic love story is kind of the narrative that ties everything together. It's the storyline. I don't think that's a spoiler because it's from 1842. If you don't know that yet, you probably weren't going to. But it's essentially a tragic love story. But each character has its own way that it develops the plot. So you could take out one of the characters, the movie wouldn't, I suppose the book, but the movie wouldn't be the same if you took out one of the characters. But each character has a standalone storyline. So you want to make sure that when you are presenting your data, that your theme is strong enough that it could stand alone, that if you told that story, that it would be enough. And I was thinking in Wuthering Heights of the companion of the main character. So she has like a side companion, and that companion makes decisions and and goes behind her back and burns letters that are being sent to her. She's doing all these other things that the main character has no idea, but they absolutely are leading to the whole plot development. If that letter wasn't burned, maybe she would have found out that he loved her. So you want to make sure that your themes are strong enough to stand alone and that story is there, but that story helps to develop that small story helps to develop the overall narrative that you're sharing, the overall narrative that answers your research question. This is often done with quotes, and I'll show some examples of that in a moment. But oftentimes it's done with anonymized participant quotes. Sometimes you'll see people put in brackets participant one. I tend not to do that. And the reason why I tend not to do that is because if you have participant one that happened to say things in a really nice way. So maybe participant one, participant three, participant five, participant seven all had the same idea that they all had tragic love stories and they all had a companion that burnt love letters that they were supposed to receive. So they all have the same, they all essentially have the same response, but participant one was the one that said it the best. And so maybe you want to use the quote of participant one. If you continuously use participant one's quotes, reviewers are going to ask you, like, why were you using just their quotes? And I think it's more important that you're able to back up that it wasn't just one person saying it rather than who said it best. So oftentimes I just don't put that in anymore. And I really haven't gotten pushback from it. I know that some reviewers do expect it, but I think more and more now that qualitative reviewers aren't really looking for that. So if somebody does say it, I think that they're probably not a qualitative researcher, which they might be more of a content expert than a qualitative researcher. The other the other place where it may be more important to do that is if you're doing more of a narrative analysis. So if I'm doing a narrative analysis and I want to make sure that the storyline or the trajectory of certain people is really clear. So if I'm doing a study, which somebody is doing this study. So somebody is doing a study about making decisions around vaccines. So looking at the decision to take flu vaccine after COVID, for example, and maybe I took COVID vaccine or I took the flu vaccine prior to COVID, and then during COVID, all of the rhetoric that happened has changed my mind. And now I'm doing something different because now in that paper, I want to make sure in that manuscript that I can show that there's a trajectory about what happened for a certain person. Then I am going to say, and oftentimes I'm going to anonymize them, not with participant one, but I'm going to give them a name. And in many studies, people will actually offer to their participants, would you like to choose a name for if, as I'm anonymizing this, would you like to choose a name? It also means that they can, if they ever read the paper, they know the name they picked, they can see their own words, which is sometimes really cathartic for people that are in qualitative research studies. So in that case, like absolutely, you would want to make sure that you are showing who they are if the context of their particular story was important. Otherwise, I would tend to lean away from that. Other things that you want to do whenever you're publishing this work is to explain the relationships that are going on, the relationships that are happening in the themes, the relationships or the patterns, the variations, anything that you're seeing in the themes or in the data. So again, you do not have to do themes. And the other thing that I was going to say about themes is that if you are doing themes, you don't want to have theme, sub-theme, sub-theme, sub-theme. If you've got 8 sub-themes, it probably means that your theme hasn't been developed. So go back to the previous webinar and take a look at how you would do that in reflexive thematic analysis, or just go back to your data. Go back to your data, and one of the things that I would recommend is going into PowerPoint and actually putting the participant quotes onto the screen and taking a look at them and see where they fit. Or if you have, I like to write things down. So if you do have Post-it notes, write things onto Post-it notes and post them all over the wall or all over the table, and see if you can find different ways in which those pieces of data are in conversation with each other. So very much like how you see here on this little pinboard diagram that they might have the theme, and these might all be participant quotes. And you want to start to see, like, where do these connect with each other? And does that change the story? And so if all of these were sub-themes to one theme, then it makes me wonder, are you actually seeing the connections here that are happening? And if I'm reviewing that, I would probably send it back to you and say, this isn't enough of a theme if you've got all of these sub-themes that are happening. Absolutely use these visual aids. So if you do go into PowerPoint and you do something, SmartArt is actually not bad because there's different ways that you can incorporate the, the hierarchies, for example, or if something happens in a cycle, you can absolutely go in and use that as a way to organize your data. Present findings objectively. So objectively is a really interesting word in qualitative analysis. I would say in applied work, we tend to be a little bit more objective, a little bit closer to the data. But absolutely, there is interpretation from the moment that you talk to somebody. There is from the first conversation that you have with whatever data source it is, whether it's a photograph, whether it's a document, an artifact, a focus group, or individual interviews, whatever it is, as soon as you have that conversation with that piece of data, there's an interpretation. From the moment that you listen to somebody, you're already starting to think about the way that they're saying things to you, the tone in their voice. All of that data is data, and you're already interpreting it. So you are being objective with your interpretation so that there is an understanding of what that data means. Each idea that you have should be backed up by data. So whether that's a participant quote, whether that is looking at whether that's looking at how you interpreted a photograph or how you interpreted a policy, you should be able to back it up with, in this policy, they use this language that's very patriarchal. They use this language that's very condescending. So and then have that piece of evidence that you're including. So make sure that when you have a theme, that's there, and where you can use visual aids, use them. Definitely use them in your own analysis, but then perfect them and put them into your papers as well, into your manuscripts. And I've got a couple of examples here. This is a depiction that is in Plus One article that we published, and this visual depiction is actually giving people the foundation of what the study was about. So it was a study about a specific program that's named IHEO, and this gave people an understanding in a different way than text could. The other benefit of this was having this visual or this figure allowed us to take all of this content out of our background where we no longer had space, but we need people to understand this. So actually, Plus One is not the worst for word limits. I'm in health, so definitely in more medical or more biomedical journals, they tend to have much tighter word limits, but Plus One's not bad. So I actually don't think that this is the worst journal to choose, and they are part of our affiliation with journals that don't have processing fees. So I think that is also a good plug for them. It did take us a while to get it published, but it did get accepted without any revisions. And I think this is the only paper that I've ever seen get accepted that I've been on. No, it's the only paper I've ever seen get accepted without revisions. So it just, again, using this is just SmartArt so that we could show that this is a process, but we also added this in to show that this is like the how, this is the what, and then this is the grounding for what our study was about. Also in that article, because it was in implementation study, and that was what the paper was focused on, this gave us the space to be able to really describe kind of what was going on so that people can visually see what's happening. So I'm saying this just to give you the idea that it doesn't always have to be the actual findings that you are depicting in any kind of visual format, but instead it might be some of the other work that you've done. Sometimes you see this where there's a table. Again, the benefit of using tables like this is that information that you would like to share, but it's just far too dense to put into text. And I feel like all of us have probably read many, many papers during our time as graduate students and since then. But imagine putting all of this into text and imagine reading all of this into text, where now we can just say, okay, I really just want to know about, if I'm reading this paper, I just want to know about what was happening in smaller urban areas. So this means that Site C and the findings that are around Site C are really important to us. Also, it gives the reader the ability to go through and find out important information that about our study and about the findings that we had. So just a different way of putting it in. I do have another paper that is currently under it's in review, but it's a paper where we had so many good quotes and we had a very, very small a very, very tight word limit. And so we used something very similar to this, where we had a table, we had perhaps we had type of organization, and we had participant quotes in here instead, so that we could showcase what the participants were saying. And the actual study was about people that had experiences with the correction system and how they wanted to receive or how they felt about receiving Hep B screening and treatment upon release. And we actually wanted to know how they wanted to receive information like that. So they had come up with the best slogans. And when you talk about participants or people with lived experience or living experience of a particular phenomenon, giving you that data, it was so good and better than any marketing geniuses could ever come up with, because it was right from people that experienced it and knew what they wanted, what they needed to hear. But they were such good quotes, and we couldn't fit all of them into the paper. So what our amazing master's student did then was to set up that so that she could pull out really important quotes. I don't know if she's here today, but she did an amazing job at that. The other thing that I think that is really important, and don't worry about like the contents of what's here, but what I do want to point out is that, again, in each theme that you have, you want to make sure that there's participant quotes that are there. I do like quotes to not be too long, but sometimes you need to have enough juice in your quote that it makes sense what people are saying. So sometimes it's okay to pull out a longer quote where it's necessary. You don't need and should not, in my humble opinion, have strings of quotes. So where you have quote, 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 I'm absolutely, as a reviewer, going to send that back to you and say, this is not my job to interpret your work. It's your job to interpret it. It's your study. So you interpret it. You're already the expert in this. You're the one that knows everything about this background. You're the one that did the study. So don't just give me the quotes, but instead what you'll see that we have here is that I actually don't like saying one woman or one participant because it also tells me that maybe you didn't know the data as well as you could have. But in this case, I did. But what I do is I walk the reader into exactly what I'm about to tell you the quote is about, and then I walk you back out of the quote as well. So always think about lead into the quote, do the quote, lead out of the quote, so that quotes aren't just hanging by themselves. And you can see that here at the very bottom, there's a much shorter quote. So this one's just a sentence, but this quote, also, this is a really long sentence. we all do this to our writing. I think afterwards it was published, so I'm not upset about it, but I would write this differently. But you can see as a consequence, women feel powerless, put on medications, fearing significant adverse effects. But they followed, but even though they were worried about this medication, they followed physicians' directives. And then I go into what the quote was. And then and then I walk out of the quote as well. So women often reluctantly trust the medications prescribed by the healthcare providers. So um, if you take nothing away from my talk today, please don't do strings of quotes. So it doesn't work. It doesn't help anybody. Always think about that quote is just a piece of evidence that you have. You don't need all of your evidence. You just need to do the interpretation. Show me a little bit of evidence about why you came up with that. Give me a really good quote, one that makes sense for you, and then walk me out of it as well. I always think that in grade 3, when we learned how to write paragraphs, that just comes back tenfold as we move into academia. That's exactly what we're doing here. We always want to make sure that we've got a really concise paragraph, an opening statement, your evidence, and then a closing statement, and just bring that back into how you present your qualitative data. Here's another just depiction, and this depiction, unlike the previous ones, is really about the findings. So this is Paige Gerke's work that she did with us on intensive care nurses that were experiencing moral distress during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what she was really finding in the research was that there was some sort of ethical event. There was something that happened, whether that was a directive that somebody that was dying couldn't have a loved one come in to see them for their last breath, or whether it was a physician giving an order that wasn't the right thing to do. And so that ethical event was really the catalyst of what happened. And the first stage of this was that the nurse had to appraise it. The nurse had to say, okay, what's happening here? Maybe this is a moral event, or maybe it's not. And so these were the things that were happening first, was that if it was to be moral distress, they had to recognize that this was a problem. Other nurses from the same unit didn't really think that it was an ethical event, and so they had no moral distress. But where it was, something else happened. So the nurses' voices were unheard. The patient was compromised. There was something that happened that made the nurse feel this distress, or it was resolved, or the nurses' voices were heard, and some kind of change was put in. That somebody did something and the patient wasn't compromised anymore. So these were the findings that she had. And the other thing that's interesting about the way she does this is that she does it on a timeline. So along the timeline, you can see what's happening initially, and then there's a change here, and the nurse has a reaction to this as well. There was immediate reactions, there was long-term reactions, there was some sort of reaction that needed to happen, whether that was that the nurse acquiesced to the situation, they avoided it, or that they took action to it. Or in some cases, there was an outcome. So an outcome like psychological distress. So a really complex way of showing how these, all of these constructs and all of this really rich data were coming together. And in one diagram, you can see the entire process of her findings. So without even reading her paper, I can tell you the entire outcome of this study. And so a paper like this is a diagram like this is a really, really rich way in which you can show somebody what was happening in your findings. So this was an interpretive description study that she did. So an applied qualitative method that she used. And it was also part of her master's work, which meant that during her defense, she was able to just put this image up and speak to this image during her defense time. We don't always write, and please don't worry about the text on this. I'm just showing this as an example, but we don't always write for manuscripts. So what I've been talking about so far is largely for manuscripts. And the reason why I'm talking about that is because whether we like it or not, it does tend to be but the currency in academia right now. Other times we write for impact. So sometimes we write for impact. And this is an example from a leadership team that I'm on for public health nursing, practice research education program, PHN Prep. You can go to their website. You can see lots of illustrations of qualitative work that we've had there. Highly recommend it. We've put them, if you go into their resource hub, you can see how we have taken some of our research and depicted it in ways that can go back to the people that need to hear it. So this is a study that we did around COVID-19 and public health nurses that were visiting or previously had been visiting home visiting to new mothers in Ontario. And then all of that stopped. All of it stopped, and nurses were seconded to deal with COVID-19 issues. And then they had to go back to work, but they were going back to work in this weird post COVID world that we all still remember, but are trying to forget. But they came back to a time where nobody was really sure what we were allowed to do. And yet there were patients that needed help, and nurses were trying to figure out how they could best help them. And so what we've done here is to use these quotes. And again, you can see that we've used longer and fuller quotes here. We don't mention where the like nurse number 1 or nurse number 7 or nurse number 41, because it doesn't matter. What matters is who they are. So here we've detailed them, and you might choose to do that if you've got policymakers, plus you've got people with lived experience. Maybe you've got if you're working with students in elementary school, you also have their teachers and their parents and administrators. So you might like to use that to really make it clear who it is that's giving the quote. But we have a large enough quote that people get the effect of what we're trying to get across. So just a different way, again, to portray or to publish your work. It doesn't always have to be in manuscripts. You can absolutely look at ways in which people have done work like this. I found this website. It's called otgraphically.com. And I'm going to guess she's an occupational therapist. And I absolutely am in love with this website. And this is an example of a poster that she presented. And I think this is a great way to learn how to present qualitative data, is to go to her website, first of all, and take a look at what she says. Because what she's done is written her paper or a dissertation, whatever it is, but you've got your data. And then she's saying, okay, now how do I put this in? One of the most important things that you can see that she's done here is that she has very, very little text. So when you are doing a poster presentation, really attempt to be very, very clear with things like your study objective. She's highlighted the important words here. But overall, there's very, very little words here. So she's really coming right into what are the really important things: assumptions about students, funneling into inappropriate placements. So really what that information looks like. Because if you're doing a poster, there's a good chance that there's going to be a time for people to come and talk to you about your poster. So make sure that's what you do. QR code is a really great idea if you do have another document to go with this. So if you have even like a one-page summary or a two-page summary of what your study was, so that if somebody did want to know more information about your themes, they could absolutely click on your QR code and get that information. Oftentimes at conferences that I've been to lately, I'll see that people actually bring that with them and can hand it out. So different ways of being able to present that data, but highly recommend going to our website to check that out. When you're talking about your discussion, really thinking about summarizing your themes to start with, if you have themes, or summarizing the main ideas, if you have main ideas. Remember, it doesn't always have to be themes. Um, but you're summarizing that, you're making the link back to your study objectives, you're making the link back to your research question and how it answered your research question. Then you're linking to existing research. So, how did your particular findings confirm, extend, challenge either research that's out there currently, or maybe even theoretical frameworks that are out there? So, in one of my studies, I look at intersectionality and I used intersectionality, and from the findings, it really came out that geography was a really important intersection that caused experiences of oppression for particular people in that study. And so it was one way that we said, if we're talking about intersectionality, we kind of need to layer this in here as well. So it was one way that we extended theory, but also really want to continuously think about, here's my findings and how does this connect to what? How does this connect to other things that are out there? Also, you want to be really clear about your implications. So what does it mean? And if you have any recommendations for policy practice, sometimes it goes in here, sometimes it goes in the conclusion, but or in like its own kind of section or subsection under the discussion. But it's really important to consider about how you're critically engaging with that kind of body of literature in that area. If there's anything in your study that you go like, wow, that was really unexpected, please feel free to lean into that in your discussion as well. Be very careful about how you talk about limitations, because oftentimes I see in qualitative research where they say it was a limitation of the study that it was a small sample size of 23, and it didn't, for a phenomenological study, for example, and it's not generalizable to the entire population. But the thing is that that's not what we were trying to do. Like, we weren't trying to make it generalizable. We weren't trying to get 1,000 people into this study, because then it wouldn't be true to phenomenology. So be really careful about how you write that. You might say something instead like, this was a qualitative study. It was never intended to do that. It was a strong sample size of 23 for this. We acknowledge that it is applicable for people in these circumstances where this is happening, and I think that is where I'd keep it. There's absolutely going to be other limitations. Just be careful that qualitative in itself is not a limitation. It's not a limitation that, perhaps it's a limitation if you interviewed 3 people and you're using interpretive description. Like, it's a low number. But it's certainly not a low number if you've interviewed 26 people. So don't write that, is what I'm saying. Instead, really lean into why it's credible, where you have made it very, very clear. And more, I'm actually seeing that limitations are not being included in some qualitative studies that or manuscripts, because the journal isn't requiring it. So like 1 or 2 sentences, particularly if there's something big, like it was a limitation of our study that we were unable to talk to the parents of the students in this particular program. So absolutely, if that would make it stronger, and if it also gives you the bandwidth to say, and so I'm going to do that study next. Like, now you have this now you have something that's documented, something that's published that says somebody needs to do this study on the parents, and you can submit that for funding. So really think strategically and logically about how you present that. In conclusion, nothing new in your conclusion. You might here put in your future directions. Sometimes you might see the implications here in the conclusion. It might be how somebody is ending their study, but sometimes it's in the discussion. So just follow the journal around that. And the other thing I wanted to talk to you as I come to the end of this is about Paul J. Sylvia. And I do not know this person, but what I can say is that this is one of my favorite books that I've ever read in academia. And this might be too much information because this is being recorded, but here we go. I read this book. I got into the bath. I read this book. The bath water turned cold. I drained it and I filled it up again because I just wanted to finish it. So I finished this book in an entire bath, and I'm a slow reader. So a great book I honestly think every graduate student should have this book. It is available in our library. I haven't read the second edition. I've only read the first edition. I imagine the second edition is just as good. But How to Write a Lot is it's got really good tips on how to write and just how to write. Really good ways of setting yourself up for success. One of them is, and I'm not going to remember the phobia, but there is a phobia of writing, and he suggests setting up with other graduate students this writing phobia group so that you can all be afraid of writing at the exact same time in the exact same Zoom room. So highly recommend it if you have like group chats or Reddit feeds, or I don't know where people are these days, but if you have places where you meet other graduate studies, one of the most effective things that I did during my PhD was I met there's somebody named Kathy Mazek, and Kathy has a great great webinars, and a great podcast about how women and non-binary people can be productive in academia and particularly around writing and publishing. So highly recommend her work as well. But I was on her Facebook group and I just said, does anybody want to write with me? And there was somebody from North Carolina, somebody from England who just happened to like to write really late at night, and myself. And we would get together every Friday. We would come on Zoom. We would ask each other what we were doing. And then we would go off Zoom, or we would go off and write and come back at the end and tell each other what we'd done. So it was a great way of having some accountability. The other book he has is called Write It Up. Write It Up is it's not as interesting to read, but I do think it's a really, really important book. And the reason why I like it is because it's super practical publishing strategies, including the exact template to write when you're submitting your letter. So when you're submitting your manuscript. So what is the letter that you write? What exactly needs to have? The exact template is in that book. So if you get the e-copy of it, or if you get it on on our York library, you can literally copy and paste it, which is what he's giving you permission to do, and write your own manuscript name, write the details in the spaces where he gives you space to do that. But he has really clear guidelines or really clear templates about how to respond to reviewer feedback. So this is my suggestion, because I can't go through everything, but maybe Kim will bucket list this for an upcoming webinar that we might do if people show interest in it. But really, really highly recommend these two books. So be really clear about what journal you're going to choose. Think about the scope, the audience, the methodology. Do all of these things fit? Really clearly go through your author guidelines before you start writing, because you don't want to change it later. If you've got some sort of referencing software like Zotero, or a different type of EndNote, is that one? Yeah. Zotero is free, so I started using that, and now that's the one that I use, so I can't stop using it. But the benefit if you're writing for a manuscript is that you can easily, if you don't get accepted to one and you had to do that in APA and somebody else wants you to do Vancouver, you can easily go in and change it. So before you clear your field, just make sure you save the last version with the fields on so that you can go on. And again, cover letter and final review and submission. Go back to Paul Sylvia's book and really follow those. It would be my like number one go-to. Um, Responding to reviewer feedback, highly recommend that you set up a table with all of their feedback, all of the feedback from reviewer one. Reviewer two is going to have reams and reams and reams of feedback. That's just how it goes. And then reviewer three has like just says good job. So that tends to be how it is. Don't get overwhelmed whenever you see the reams and how long it looks, because when you start putting things into a table, you can one by one go through each one. You don't have to change everything. In some cases, you might go, yeah, that's a really, really good point. And I've changed that on line 41. I've made the following change and write that through. But you also might want to say, the reason why we chose not to include participant numbers is because, and then explain why you did that. And oftentimes I might point to Jan Morse, to Sandalowski, or to Sally Thorne, and all of them have really good ways in which they, like saturation, for example. We don't use the term saturation anymore, but reviewers still expect it sometimes. And so I won't use it. And I'll just often quote one of them and say, like this is an outdated term. We know it came from grounded theory. This isn't a grounded theory study. Therefore, I'm not using it. You don't have to acquiesce to everything that they do, but in some cases you might like to. Be ready because it takes them like 8 months to get the feedback back to you. And I know it's torturous during that time, but when they do give it back to you, they often want it back within 2 weeks. So just make sure that when you do get your feedback, that you are able to clear out some time. And if you can't, write back to them, because editors are pretty good usually with saying, okay, take 2 extra weeks. And just before I come to the end, I want to share one more thing. Let's see. You're probably going to see my whole screen here. That's okay. Yep. The last thing that I wanted to show you is Jane. And if you're unfamiliar with Jane, Jane is a journal and author name estimator. So there's a number of things that you can do here. You can find journals, you can find authors, you can find articles. So if I wanted to know the best, I'm going to write in the title. Today's was writing qualitative manuscripts. So if this is the title of my article, I can find journals, and it's going to give me a list of what are the best journals. I mean, clearly I would have something, because I don't think dental hygiene is probably the ideal place for this, but it will give me, it's low confidence because I didn't have a very clear title. But if I had intimate partner violence in women's health, it should give me much better results. Yeah, so you can see that +1, this is a high quality open access journal. It also gives me what the article influence is, and it'll show other articles so that I can go back and take a look at other articles within their own journal that were published, which sometimes is a good way to kind of talk somebody into talking an editor into publishing in that space. Thanks very much for listening. Absolutely go ahead and stop the recording there.